Hey guys, Richard Holder here. You know, we talk about turbo LS motors all the time, but let's take a look at what goes into building your own turbo kit. In this video, we're going to take a look at my low dollar do-it-yourself turbo kit. Now we're going to take a look at it on an LS. This is kind of my go-to single turbo combination whenever I want to run turbo or any kind of testing on the LS. And the reason that I use it because it relies on stock exhaust manifolds. Now before I had run these tubular headers, and I'll show you a picture of them here, and while they look fancy, they're stainless and they're mandrel bends and they've got all the flow that you need. The reality is they're just not a good choice. I mean, I used them a lot on the Big Bang stuff, but the problem with them, as opposed to a factory exhaust manifold, is that while they might flow well, and they might flow even better than a stock exhaust manifold, they're just problematic. I mean, when you try to bolt these things on, they'll bolt on, but they're in the way of everything. You don't have good plug access. They definitely will burn plug wires. They weren't made for with fitment in mind and accessibility, and they certainly weren't made for real turbocharging in mind. That's the reason why, although I've used them in the past, I've since made another Y pipe to adapt to stock exhaust manifolds that work much better. And there's plenty of power, and I know guys are all consumed with, yeah, but what about the flow rate? I got to have all that exhaust flow. And while it's true that a stock exhaust manifold was not designed to flow the exhaust levels that are associated with 800, 900, 1,000 horsepower, the reality is it works very well, because ultimately what limits the flow of that hot side is usually the turbo itself. That's usually the big choke point, and it's not the manifolds. I mean, you can have restrictive manifolds, and we've seen that on some of these applications, but they work very well for all of these power levels. I'm going to show you what happened when we ran them on a couple of combinations. So let's start out with, but I also need to show you what it took to get there and what we use to make these kinds of things. But the first thing we need to start out with, if you're going to the wrecking yard and getting a motor, here's what you need to get. It makes it a lot less expensive and easier for you to ultimately create the single turbo system that you need to create to fit in your chassis. So if you go get a 4.8, a 5.3, or 6.0, or whatever else you're going to get, make sure that you obviously, first of all, get the factory exhaust manifolds. It's very important that they have the manifolds on them. You don't want to have to go buy those later on, whether it's from the wrecking yard or eBay or online or somewhere. Maybe somebody will give some to you. We throw away lots of sets of them, so we have some extra ones laying around sometimes if we don't throw them away. But if you get your motor, get it complete. If you're buying a complete motor, get everything. And here's the other critical part, and it's the thing that a lot of guys forget about, and this makes it a lot easier and less expensive to create your single turbo kit. When you get your stock exhaust manifolds, the wrecking yards here where we get our stuff, they basically just cut the cats off. They've got big hydraulic pinchers that they use, and they just scissor the rest of the exhaust system off with the cats and just remove that. What they do leave there is a section of pipe that's maybe about this long, but the important thing that they leave is the flange that attaches that pipe, the exhaust, all the rest of the exhaust pipe and the cats and everything. It has the flange that connects that to the stock exhaust manifold. So if you had to go buy that, that's going to be another expense. You're going to have to pay for shipping, and it's not a cheap deal. So if you can get that already, it's part of the complete motor that you got, then it will come with it. And basically, that's the beginning of your turbo kit. Get both of them. The right side and the left side are different, so make sure you get them. Also, if you have a section of stainless pipe that's going to be the right size diameter, 2 1/4, 2 1/2, 2 inch, it doesn't even matter what it is. Whatever it is, just make the rest of your exhaust out of that. Again, you're not worried about making a high flow, pro mod race system. You're getting all of the exhaust going to the turbo. So get those pieces when you get your complete motor. The next thing is building the rest of the hot side, building the Y pipe basically. And I'll show you a picture of mine. We built this because it's easy to put on the dyno, and that's what we were configuring it for. And I get complaints about this. Hey, you need to build that so it fits in a chassis. No, I don't. You need to build it so it fits in the chassis. And that's the thing. You build the Y pipe to fit in whatever application you have. And a lot of times it's not just chassis, because if I built one that goes in a 69 Camaro, everyone would say, except for the people that have 69 Camaros, well, not everybody has 69 Camaros. Why don't you build it for something that we all have? Everybody doesn't have the same thing. So here's where you guys come in. You have to build your Y pipe to position the turbo in the available space to fit the turbo. If that's a truck and you've got room over on one side, position the turbo there, run all of the exhaust to that turbo, and then you have to buy we normally use a T4 flange. On my setup, I actually ended in a 3-inch V-band and then made V-band to T3, T4, or T6 adapters just to make it easier for me on the dyno so I could run any kind of turbo that I wanted. But most guys, what they'll do is they'll bring those two pipes together, one from each side. And again, it doesn't matter how long. If one's a little bit longer than the other because of where you had to position a turbo, doesn't make any difference. Get them both together, weld on the V-band flange, mount your turbo. When you weld on that V-band flange, or when you weld on the T4 turbo flange, make sure that it's oriented so your turbo is positioned where you want it. So that, and here's the thing to think about, make sure that the exhaust can go back down, the downpipe can go wherever it needs to go. Also make sure that your cold side can go to your intercooler and then to your throttle body. Make sure that the turbo is positioned right. That's the other thing that the V-band does for me when I put it on there. Once I put the turbo on there, I can kind of clock the turbo and move it around. So I have options. Not only can I move the hot side and the cold side, I can also swing the turbo around, which is nice and which is why I do it on a V-band. The next thing to think about is wastegate. Now, wastegate is one area where I don't skimp. I usually put a good wastegate on it because wastegate is critical for controlling the boost. I have run stuff like from CX Racing and other inexpensive ones, and they have worked. I just haven't found their spring rating for boost to be accurate. Sometimes they tell me this is an 8-pound spring, and sometimes it's 13 pounds, sometimes it's 8 pounds. So be prepared for that if you use a low dollar wastegate. And also make sure that you get the wastegate mounting flange, because you're going to have a section of tubing welded to the wastegate flange, and then you're going to have to position the wastegate. I like to position the wastegate in a bend because as exhaust is flowing, if it flows directly to the wastegate, that usually makes the wastegate most effective. On my Y pipe, I use 2 of them so that we can have control in the engine dyno. Out on the street or on a chassis down or something, usually one wastegate, especially a 45 millimeter like we use, is enough. If you're going big, you can go bigger on the wastegate. You can go to a 60 or something bigger and make that work. But that's one area where I don't skimp. The other thing, obviously, you're going to have to get is the turbo itself. Now, there are a lot of options for turbos, and choose the turbo based on your desired power output. If you're going for 600 or 700 horsepower, something like an S366 or the eBay GT45, that works well. And the eBay GT45 is $163, so they're very, very cheap. If you want to go bigger, which I will show you in this video, like an S475 size turbo, you can also do that. It will be a little bit more money, but it makes a lot more power. So the next thing after the turbo is you're going to have an oil feed from the motor, from some oil fitting in the motor, up to the turbo. That's usually a braided line and a couple of AN to pipe fittings. Then you're going to have an oil drain, and they sell drain fittings, or you can weld a fitting into your oil pan. Some guys put them into the front cover. That also works, just as long as the oil is draining back and that the turbo is above the level of the oil so that it all drains back into the pan. Now, the final thing is, or one of the other things, is the downpipe. You need to have a downpipe going from the exhaust on the turbo to go back down into your exhaust. You can go down as a single, make it as big as you can for maximum flow. You can go down as a single, 3.5 or 4 or whatever, and then Y it into a dual exhaust. You can run it all as a single exhaust. That's going to be more your available space and what kind of application you have. Now let's talk about the cold side. So the cold side can be done a number of different ways. And for both the hot side tubing and the Y pipe tubing, and to some extent, I've seen guys do this on the cold side as well. If you want to go really cheap, and I've done this before, I go to my local muffler shop and I get the stuff that they cut off of the stock exhaust. So I can go through their scrap yard basically and grab different bends that I need. And sometimes you get, if it's factory stuff, a lot of times that's stainless, and they're just going to throw all that stuff away. Or they have a guy that comes by and gets all of their stock mufflers and the associated tubing. Now, they'll usually just give you that and let you just go chop it up and take what you want. But even if you had to pay $5 or $10 or $20 or whatever it is, that's cheap comparing to buying bends from, online or from your local place. I do the same thing for the cold side. If you want to do aluminum, you can use aluminum on that, and that's a good way to go. It's more expensive that way. I've seen guys do hot side out of mild steel because it's cheap and it's free. And the other place to get those bends, and you can find good bends at the wrecking yard. You can especially find, if you're doing a single turbo, you can find stock exhaust setups, especially on an older vehicle. Like if you were doing, because this works for any kind of motor. If you were doing an early small block Chevy, you can find a Y section on a truck where they run the two exhausts into a single exhaust. Well, they're running that into a single exhaust. And even if the merge goes in at like a 90 degree, it still works, and that still functions as a single turbo kit. Get that Y section, have it face forward, run the one pipe up, put your turbo flange on it, and you have a turbo kit, and that actually works. So that's another way to go, and it's very inexpensive. But if you're going to do aluminum tubing, it's really inexpensive now to find aluminum tubing and like front mount intercooler kits. Get universal ones. Get as big of and if you're doing an air-to-air, get as big of an air-to-air as you can fit in your location. And I would get big tubing going to it also, so you can free up, the flow rate of the cold side. I wouldn't worry so much about response rate because the tubing is bigger coming from the turbo. But I like to get as much flow as I can through the core, and then the core obviously is always a balance between flow and cooling. But if this is an inexpensive kind of junkyard deal, you're not going big on the cost there. So get all of that, obviously the air from the turbo through the intercooler up to your throttle body. And again, you don't have to worry about going to a big throttle body. Just get all of your couplers. Coupler sets are usually fairly inexpensive. I use just regular clamps. You can go with T-bolt clamps if you're running lots of boost. I think I'm going to do a video coming up here where I actually just tape the stuff together and see how much boost I can run just with Gorilla Tape to find out, to show people, hey, look, you can actually run 4 pounds or 3 pounds or 20 pounds or whatever the number is just using tape if everything is lined up right. So that will be an interesting test. But let's check out how well all of this stuff, when you put it together, let's find out how well it actually works. We're running out a couple of combinations. Let's check it out. To further illustrate that our do-it-yourself low-buck turbo kit actually works, we're going to step up in power and show you that, what happens if you don't want to just make 700 horsepower or so with that really inexpensive eBay GT45 turbo. What if you're looking at like 1,000 horsepower turbo? Now, if you're going to make that kind of power, you're going to have to step up, obviously, in costs on the turbo itself. All the other things basically stay the same, but you're going to have to step up in the cost of the turbo. And in this case, we ran a Summit Racing S475. There are other options out there that will get you to, the 1,000 horsepower level, like a 7875 Gen 2 from VS Racing. And obviously there are other choices out there too, but you're going to have to step up above that GT45 size or a 366 Borg Warner, which is also a good one for that lower power level. But this was a Summit Racing turbo, and it's about 649 or so. And as I said, it's a Borg S475 kind of copy. We ran 8.5 pounds on it, and it was making 718 horsepower. If you want, I'll go ahead and show you our theoretical NA combination. But we stepped up in boost on this thing, and as before, remember, these exhaust manifolds were obviously designed for a 300 horsepower 5.3 liter, not something that needs to flow the exhaust of 3 times that much power in this particular case. So we stepped up in boost. We went up to 10.5 pounds or 10.8, 13, 15.5. And then our final run of the day was just over 17 pounds, where we were over 900 horsepower. This is 923, and we've seen this before. I have this video up comparing the GT45 versus the Summit Racing turbo, and obviously they're two different size turbos. And that's exactly why I did that comparison. Not because I'm comparing a boost for boost and guys want to know, well, which one makes more power at this boost level. Really, the amount of power that they make at the same boost, if both of them can supply exactly the same curve, they'll make really close to the same power. that's not really of interest to me to show which one of those, if one makes 1 or 2 more horsepower than the other one does, in a level where they're both supporting the same amount of power, because turbo guys don't really want to know that. Especially not at that lower power level. What they want to know is which one makes more power. And if it does make more power, does it cost me more money? And in that comparison, the GT45 costs less than the Summit Racing Turbo or than any S475 Turbo. And you have to pay for what you get. You have 1,000 horsepower potential, but you pay more money for that, and that's what that video was. But this shows the same thing. It shows that this low-dollar do-it-yourself turbo kit with the stock exhaust manifolds and some sort of homemade Y-pipe that you make to fit in your particular chassis in your application, it works well enough, and we could have gone to even higher. There was more power to be had here. I especially wish I would have used an electronic wastegate controller, so we could have had a nice, smooth, even boost curve and not a falling curve, which we're having here because of a change in back pressure on this setup. And the back pressure is more from the size of the turbo than it is from the exhaust manifolds, because back pressure in the system that's inherent in any turbo sizing, unless you have a really, really big hot side relative to the flow rate of the exhaust and the power output and displacement of the motor, you're almost always going to have more back pressure than boost pressure. And unfortunately, that has an effect on the wastegate setting, especially with a manual controller. So that was less of a problem on the Summit Turbo than it was on the smaller eBay Turbo, which the exhaust back pressure started getting higher a lot quicker on the eBay Turbo, even though the power output was lower. But do-it-yourself turbo kit, no problem. Stock exhaust manifolds, I do like them very much because of not burning plug wires and having plug access, and obviously they can support lots of power, and I've never maxed one out, but I know that the limit is way above this. Let's get to our conclusion. As I indicated in the previous section of the video, we've run this single turbo do-it-yourself kit on a ton of different LS combinations. I'm sure at least 25 or 30 different combinations, and it always works well. In fact, it's my go-to setup for any single turbo application. I'd much rather choose this, as we've talked about, than the tubular headers because of the concern for plug wires and access to the spark plug. So this is a much better setup. And the other thing to think about is, even though these stock exhaust manifolds were obviously never designed for this increased flow rate at these kinds of power levels, they work very well. And the other thing I like about them, obviously, is they're cast iron, so they retain the heat, which is also good for a turbo combination. So here I want to show you, we can show you, like I said, any of 25 or 30 different examples where we've used this successfully, and it works really well. This particular one was a 5.3 liter. This one came from my buddy David Freiberg on loan. It had forge internals. It had TrickFlow 205 heads. We had a Summit Stage 3 turbo cam in this thing, and it was a 600/575 lift split, a 231/234 degree duration split, and 115+5 LSA. It also had a fast intake manifold on it. We had fast 89-pound injectors. And I had my Y-pipe with 2 TurboSmart wastegates. Now you can do that any way that you want, and I showed you kind of the positions of where you might want to take a look at positioning the wastegates, whether you run 1 or 2. I normally run 2 on the engine dyno just because it works out well and we have good control over it. Now, I say that, but what was kind of limiting this particular test is the fact that I use a manual wastegate controller and not an electronic controller. But the other thing that was limiting this first test is the fact that I had that eBay GT45 turbo on there. We ran this up fairly good. This was only about 8 pounds, and it made 664 horsepower. Now the problem with this is I didn't ever run this particular combination naturally aspirated. I can kind of show you where it would be, having run hundreds and hundreds of NA/LS combinations, but I did not run it NA with that specific turbo cam. But this is kind of what it would look like, and as you can see, we're because we have a falling boost curve on the eBay turbo, the thing is not carrying out like it should be. But this is more about the turbo setup, the turbo system, the do-it-yourself kit with the stock exhaust manifolds, and it works very well. Here's 8 pounds, and we went up to 11.8 pounds, and then we went up to 14 pounds. And again, we're still seeing the thing with a falling curve, but in this case, we're making 776 horsepower and 786 foot-pounds of torque, and I think we probably could get near 800. We've run near that on a smaller 4.8 liter that seems to work a little better on a smaller motor because of the exhaust back pressure on that particular turbo. But again, this is more about the turbo setup, and I wanted to show you an eBay turbo because if you're doing a low buck do-it-yourself kind of turbo kit, that's the kind of turbo you're probably going to put on it. At least you would in this kind of power range. Now, if you want something that's going to make even more power, obviously you'd step up in turbo size. But the nice thing is, with this kit, I mean, we've run fairly big turbos on it. We've run S480 turbos and the Precision 7675 that we ran. Those are capable of, maybe 1200 or so. So you can certainly flow enough exhaust on that system, even with the stock exhaust manifolds. I honestly think we could go way above that if we had a really big turbo and we had a combination that could take advantage of it. I don't think we'd get into a flow limitation of the exhaust or see excessive back pressure just because of those stock exhaust manifolds. But it would be interesting to test to find out where that limit is, because we ran the tubular headers on all the big bang motors because we were looking for, in the case of the 6 liter, I mean, that was up around 1500 horsepower. I don't know if there would be a big difference in power between those tube manifolds and the stock exhaust manifolds and the do-it-yourself kit at that elevated power level. It'd be an interesting test. But I can tell you that if I was doing a dedicated system that was actually going to run in a car, I wouldn't pick those tubular manifolds. I would make something like that had the flow rate of that, but also had the spark plug access of the stock exhaust manifold. So let's take a look at another example where we ran even more boost and more power with the do-it-yourself turbo kit. Okay, guys, I hope this helped you figure out what you need to do to make your own turbo system for your application. And remember, although we did this on an LS, it could apply to a Coyote or a small block Ford, a big block Chevy, heck, even a Buick or Cadillac. It doesn't matter. It all works the same way. You can make your own Y pipe, have it fit your combination. But remember, when you get your motor from the wrecking yard, especially on the LS, make sure that you get the flanges that go from the exhaust manifolds out to the exhaust, because that's a good start toward making your own Y pipe. Then all you have to do, get the turbo mounted where it needs to go, run the exhaust up to it, and then get all the boost from the turbo into your motor. I'm Richard Holder, guys. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell. Do all that stuff. I got more and more testing coming up right after Christmas.